episode 4 of Watercolor Fundamentals. Today, we're going to continue from the last episode on hard edges, and we're going to look at creating soft edges with watercolor. I have some paint mixed up already, which, I went into in episode 1 and episode 2. So I've already got some mixed up here. It's actually fairly thick. I've got quite a bit of pigment in the water here. I'm using a number 8 sized round. This is a Escoda Versatile. It's a lovely round brush. I'll put a link to that in the description. And as you recall from, or maybe you don't recall, maybe you haven't seen episode 3 yet, but nevertheless, in episode 3, I did a demonstration on doing hard edges. So today we're going to look at soft edges, and just so to kind of reiterate, I'm just going to tap the tip of my brush in here just to get a little bit of the excess moisture out of the tip and prevent making a big pool of paint on the paper. And if I just take my brush and apply this to the dry paper, where the watercolor hits the edge of the paper, you see I get nice hard edges. Okay? And you'll use this to define edges of shapes, do your details, all that kind of stuff. But in watercolor, you can get a combination of 2 different edges. Well, you can achieve 2 different edge types to be more clear. You can get the hard edges, textured edges as well, which is another variation of hard edges, again, something I spoke to in episode 3. But you can also get soft edges. And soft edges give a really nice characteristic to watercolor, and it's a really good idea to try to work towards having a mixture of both in your painting. So without further ado, let's talk about how do we get soft edges. So to get the hard edges, one of the main ingredients that we require is a dry surface. The dry surface is going to give us the hard edges. So having a surface that's not as dry is going to not give you a hard edge, thus giving you a soft edge. And the thing with soft edges is there's all sorts of ways to go about it. What I'll primarily speak to are the ones that I use regularly. So to start, though, I'll just kind of show you the inverse of what I did there. So dry paper and then wet paper. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw a little square here. Okay, so just a little square. Because I'm going to paint with clean water and sometimes it's difficult to see. So I'm just going to take some clean water and I'm just going to go into this square. Now I don't know if the sheen shows up at all for you, but I'm actually angling my perspective and looking at my paper across the paper so I can see the shine on the paper. And I'm painting water in here. And what I'm trying to avoid is seeing any real buildup. I don't want a big pool of water on here. I just want the surface to be nice and wet. Okay? So it just should have a nice shine to it. But if I were to tilt the paper, there's not so much water on there that it's going to run all over the place and pool up. That I don't want. If you do see that happening, you can kind of get all the moisture out of your brush and go back in and try and suck some of that excess water up. Or you can just wait and let that soak in. So now, and I'm just going to run this across the towel, get the rest of the water out. I'm going to go into my paint. So there I had a dry surface, and now I have a wet surface. You can see if I try to do the same thing in here, I don't get the hard edges that I got there. they soften out into the moisture. And there's another little thing to be aware of once you're dealing with a wet area too, is this little atrocity that happened down in the bottom. And it happens when you lift your brush out in a wet area. So if I drag my brush down here, wherever I lift it, it's going to release. So you do need to be careful when you're doing these types of things. I'll get more into this in another episode. I'll get into more wet and wet watercolor techniques. And that's a really good thing to speak about in that. But hard edges, soft edges. Now, I can control that a little bit. You know, if I painted this water and then waited a little while for it to soak in, maybe it wasn't quite so shiny, it would still soften around the edges, but not as much. And that will change as you let that water soak into the paper. Now, the other thing, I use this sometimes. It's not something that I use too often, but it's just a really good, clear example of how you get a soft edge, right? On dry paper, on wet paper. Now, the other thing that I'll do quite often is starting with a hard edge on dry and then softening one edge, okay? And it involves a couple of things. One, I'm going to essentially repeat this. And then the other thing is I'm going to need to be a little bit quick because I'm going to want to apply water to one edge and then soften out the edge, okay? And to do that, I'm going to need to apply the paint, and then I'm going to need to clean my brush so that it has no paint in it, just water, and we'll talk about how much water. And then I'm going to go back into the edge of what I paint, and I'm going to try and soften the edge, okay? So, I'll grab some paint, get my brush nice and soaked up with paint, and then just go in and just get, again, a little bit out of the tip. And I'm going to go into the side here, and I'm just going to go, and I'm going to paint a little shape like I did when we started this. Now, at this point, I already know which side I want to soften. It's going to be the right side. So I just go through my shape, and I'm going to finish my brushstroke on the white, on the right. Then I'm going to clean my brush, get some of that excess moisture out, and then going perpendicular to this shape, I'm going to bring my brush into it, and I'm going to soften it out. So I'm pointing my brush perpendicular to where I painted. And what happens in that way is the tip touches into that paint. But in the belly of the brush is still some clean water, because when I got the clean water in there, I only tapped a little bit out of the tip, just so I wouldn't be introducing a bunch of excess moisture into the edge here, and then it would push back into this shape that I initially painted. And then as I drag away, the clean water is kind of coming out and mixing and diluting that paint, so you get this nice, soft, feathered edge. And I'll do this quite a bit. It's probably one of the more common ways I'll use to create soft edges. Now, there's another way that we can do this, and it's kind of a variation on this one that I did here, okay? So what I'm going to do is, just take my little pencil here. These are great pencils, by the way. I've been using this pencil for a long time, little Pentel P205. They're nice, they're not terribly expensive, and I just take the lead. I change the lead out, and I buy a replacement lead for it, and I go for a 2B softness. That's generally what I prefer. So what I'm going to do here, just so that you can kind of see what I'm doing, I'm going to paint a little rectangle. Okay. And then I'm going to take some clean water and I'm going to paint into this rectangle. like what I did up here, except there's going to be a bit of a difference. So I go in and I paint this, and I make sure it's got a nice sheen to it. Okay, get that excess moisture out, grab some paint, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint, I'm going to go on this side, I'm going to paint into that water. And what happens, as you see, is the left side will soften into the water, and the right side, I get a hard edge. So that's another way that I will go after a soft edge. And the interesting thing, I think, is that for these examples here, I used water, right? Water, and then water, and then water. But there'd be nothing to prevent me from using paint, instead of the water, right? I could put a red in here and then put a blue into it, and then it would kind of mix out into a bit of purple out around the fringes. You can do all sorts of things. But ultimately, these are the two main ways I'll go after soft edges. I'll do this sometimes as well, but usually when I do things like this, I'm playing a little bit more with the consistency of the paint, which is going to be the subject of another episode, paint consistency and how to implement it. But for now, this is soft edges. These are the basics. If you learn to achieve these, I think you're well on your way. So thank you very much for tuning in today. The color that I'm using today is Daniel Smith Prussian Green. It's a very lovely blue-green. I'll put a link to it also in the description. So without further ado, thank you very much, and we'll see you again for episode 5. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great day.